Happy Halloween, my little baddies! This is Cat's Got Your Terror, and tonight on this special Halloween edition, I'm going to be taking you, my special guest in my haunted Manor of Death, through some scary stories to tell in the dark. Do you remember those books? If you were born in the 90s, you definitely remember those books and their terrifying illustrations. Fun fact, when I was in elementary school, I was banned from checking them out for a period of time because the librarian was tired of the other kids complaining that I had them for so long. The spooky started early, my friends. But now I'm all grown up and I don't have to borrow them anymore from the library. They're all mine. So I thought it might be fun to read you a couple of my favorite scary stories to tell in the dark. So sit back, turn off some lights, and remember, they're only stories. Or are they? All right, so I'm going to start with the first one from the original Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And it's called The Thing. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near the post office, talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. Then, it was gone. But soon, it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then it turned around and went back into the field. Then it came out a third time and started toward them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared, and they started running. When they finally stopped, they decided that they were being foolish. They weren't sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon, they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm going to try to touch it, then we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered in its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes that sunk deep into its head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran, but this time the skeleton followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out in the road for a while. Then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. The night Ted died, Sam said he looked just like the skeleton. So that's the first one. And of course, that one's terrifying. Like, first of all, to see something standing in a random field, just like out in the middle of nowhere, scary. Then it's like following you, scarier. Then you get up close to it and it looks like a skeleton, even terrifyinger. That's a word, by the way, that I made up just now. But yeah, so there you go. There's that one. So the next one is from More Scary Stories Still in the Dark, which is the second book. This one is titled One Sunday Morning. Ida always went to the 7 o'clock Sunday morning service at her church. Usually, she heard the clanging of the church bells while she was eating breakfast. But this morning, she heard them while she was still in bed. "That means I'm late," she thought. Ida jumped out of bed and quickly dressed and left without eating or looking at the clock. It was still dark outside, but usually it was dark at that time of year. Ida was the only one on the street. The only sound she heard were the clatter of her shoes on the pavement. Everybody must already be at church, she thought. Ida took a shortcut through the cemetery. She quickly slipped into church and found a seat. The service had already begun. When she caught her breath, Ida looked around. The church was filled with people she'd never seen before. But the woman next to her looked familiar. Ida smiled. "It's Josephine Kerr," she thought. "But she's dead. She died a month ago." Suddenly, Ida felt uneasy. She looked around again. Her eyes began to adjust to the dim light. Ida saw some skeletons in suits and dresses. This is a service for the dead, Ida thought. Everybody here is dead, except me. Ida noticed that some of them were staring at her. They looked angry, as if she had no business being there. Josephine Kerr leaned toward her and whispered, "Leave right after the benediction if you care for your life." When the service came to an end, the minister gave her his blessing. "The Lord bless you and keep you," he said. "The Lord make his face shine upon you." Ida grabbed her coat and walked quickly towards the door. When she heard footsteps behind her, she glanced back. Several of the dead were coming towards her. Others were getting up to join them. The minister went on. Ida was so frightened she began to run. Out the door she ran, with a pack of shrieking ghosts at her heels. "Get out!" one of them screamed. Another shouted, "You don't belong here," and ripped her coat away. As Ida ran through the cemetery, a third grabbed a hat from her hat from her head. "Don't come back," it screamed, and shook its arm at her. By the time Ida reached the street, the sun was rising and the dead had disappeared. Did this really happen? Ida asked herself. Or have I been dreaming? That afternoon, one of Ida's friends brought over her coat and hat, or what was left of them. They had been found in the cemetery, torn to shreds. So that's the second story. The third one comes from Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. Of course. And this one really freaked me out as a kid and like literally stayed with me because just like the thought of, oh, sorry, I don't want to give it away. So actually I can't talk about it, but we'll talk about it after. Anyway. This one is called Harold. Okay. This one, seriously, guys, it really gets to me, and I'll tell you why after. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, was it boring. All day the two men tended to their cows. At night, they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. Let's make a doll the size of a man, he said. It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds. It should look like Harold, Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes just like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night, they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they were both sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you'd better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas. Honestly, right answer. "And that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in the corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and again, the doll grunted, and that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside Harold, and they were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning, they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back to the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then, one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's our imagination." Alfred replied, "We've just been up here in the mountains too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long, he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. Duh. They decided to take the cows down to the valley that same day. When they had left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one of them wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. After all, what could a doll do? They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He didn't see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled down and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. And that's why Kat hates dolls. I'm pretty sure that's probably where it started, now that I think about it. I read these books so much as a kid, and that one probably scarred me. For real. Just also, we'll have to talk about tulpas, but I'm pretty sure that that's what that was, which a tulpa is basically something that if you believe in it enough, it becomes real. So I think like them talking to Harold and making it a thing made it real. So don't do that. All right. So one of my other favorite things about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is that at the end, the last chapter is always full of stories that are a little fun, and horror can also be funny. So I'm going to share with you some funny ones now so that you can have some treats with your tricks. This one's called Wait Till Martin Comes. An old man was out for a walk. When a storm came up, he looked for a place to take shelter. Soon he came to an old house. He ran up on the porch and knocked on the door, but nobody answered. By now, rain was pouring down, thunder was booming, and lightning was flashing. So he tried the door. When he found it was unlocked, he went inside. Except for a pile of wooden boxes, the house was empty. He broke up some of the boxes and made a fire with them. Then he sat down in front of the fire and dried himself. It was so warm and cozy that he fell asleep. When he woke up, a black cat was sitting near the fire. It stared at him for a while. Then it purred. That's a nice cat, he thought, and he dozed off again. When he opened his eyes, there was a second cat in the room, but this one was as big as a dog. It looked at him very closely and it asked, "Shall we do it now?" "No," said the other cat. "Let's wait till Martin comes." I must be dreaming, thought the old man. He closed his eyes again. Then he took another look, but now there was a third cat in the room, and this one was as big as a tiger. It looked the old man over and it asked, "Shall we do it now?" "No," said the others. "Let's wait until Martin comes." The old man jumped up and jumped out the window and started running. "When Martin comes, you tell him I couldn't wait," he called. I also wouldn't be waiting for Martin. This is called The Brown Suit. A woman came to a funeral parlor to see her husband's corpse. "You did a good job," she said to the undertaker. "He looks just the way he always looked, except for one thing. My husband always wore a brown suit, but you gave him a blue suit." "That's not a problem," said the undertaker. "We can easily change it." When she returned later, her husband was wearing a brown suit. "Now he looks just the way he always did," she said. "I know you went to a lot of trouble." "It was no trouble," he said. "As it happens, there's a man here who was wearing a brown suit, and his widow felt that the blue would be better. He is about your husband's size, so we gave him the blue one and gave your husband the brown one." "Even so," she said, "changing all that clothing was a big job." "Not really," said the undertaker. "All we did was exchange their heads." Because, I mean, like, how could you tell? Producer John is horrified. All right, guys. This last one is super short, but it's a really good story. And you could definitely use it as a joke or something to say at a party. But anyway, here we go. The girl was late getting home for supper, so she took a shortcut through the cemetery. But oh, it made her nervous. When she saw another girl ahead of her, she hurried to catch up. "Do you mind if I walk with you?" she asked. "Walking through the cemetery at night scares me." "I know what you mean," the other girl said. "I used to feel that way when I was alive." And with that, I wish you, my cherished guest, the happiest of Halloweens, and thank you for joining us this season. Also, a huge thank you to producer John and Albright Entertainment for making the magic happen every week. This literally wouldn't happen without you. Seriously. Thank you, and thank you. Until we meet again, happy terrors.